Good morning. My name is Karen Reimers. I'm the president of the Florida eClub for Rotary International, and it's my great pleasure today to welcome our guest speaker, Linda Carpenter from the American Association of University Women. We're delighted to have Linda coming to speak with us today about a very important topic, the gender pay gap. And just a few words about her association, the American Association of University Women, or AAUW. This is a tenacious and trailblazing organization that's been advocating for women and girls since 1881. They do advocacy, education, and research work. It's a nonprofit organization. And again, Linda's topic today is the gender pay gap. So welcome, Linda.
Good morning, and thank you so much for this opportunity to talk with you today about the gender pay gap, which really is one of the most pressing issues facing women today. As Karen said, I represent AAUW, and I'm giving this presentation on behalf of AAUW. Let me share my screen. There we go. And I'm going to, hang on. Should have tried this before. There it is. Can we do, no. Never mind. I was going to try and do a side by side, but we'll do it this way. This is good. So you've heard AAUW, you've heard the American Association of University Women. Let me elaborate a little bit. You're probably wondering who we are and why we're concerned about the gender pay gap. As Karen said, the acronym AAUW stands for the American Association of University Women. But the acronym and AAUW is actually a national grassroots organization. We were established, as Karen said, in 1881 with a mission to advance equity for women and girls. In recent years, that mission has been expanded to include equity for all people. We are nonpartisan, but not apolitical. We don't support any candidates or parties, but we do advocate for issues that are in line with our mission. We also welcome women and men to membership. At the moment, applicants who hold at least an associate degree are eligible for membership, but that apparently is up for some discussion at the moment. So this presentation today draws on many sources, particularly work that was done at AAUW National in accord with our mission to advance equity and to increase understanding of the gender pay gap. So here are the topics that we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with defining the pay gap and end with what we can do about it. So let's make sure we're all talking about the same thing. What actually is the pay gap? What does it refer to? The pay gap refers to typical earnings, that is median earnings of all workers, and looking at salaries of all men and women working full time. The median is that halfway point where 50% of workers are above it and 50% are below. So what we are looking at is typical earnings that are typically measured weekly or annually and are expressed as a percentage. This schematic actually illustrates the idea of pay gap and its inverse, the earnings ratio. The actual pay gap is the difference between women's and men's earnings, what's left over after you subtract the lesser amount, which is women's. But we often say that women earn some percentage of what men earn. Women earn so many cents on the dollar. That value is called the earnings ratio. And so when we say that in 2019, the ratio was 79% and the pay gap was 21%, what we're saying essentially is that women on average were earning in 2019 79 cents on the dollar compared to white men. Sometimes this is confusing because we talk pay gap, but the values that we cite are the earnings ratio. So keep in mind that we're talking about a kind of two sides of the same coin. I will tell you up front, the gender pay gap exists across all demographics in every part of the country and in nearly every line of work, including female-dominated professions like teaching and nursing. So the question that has to come up is, what causes that pay gap? Well, there's no single cause. It's a complex issue. And so there are a number of factors that mitigate and come together to influence the pay gap. We will discuss each of them in order, starting with race and ethnicity. So race and ethnicity is a major factor. The pay gap affects women from all backgrounds, but its effects vary among racial and ethnic groups. We are on 8, right, okay. You can see in this graph, the earnings ratio by race and ethnicity is shown among full-time workers in 2018, and it's very easy to see that women earn less than men across every racial ethnic demographic, but it is far worse for Black and Hispanic women of color. And so you look at Latinas, and they are earning on average 54 cents on the dollar. Let me see where we are. Okay. This is between ethnic groups, racial and ethnic groups. Let's look at a comparison within racial and ethnic groups. And what you can see is that within these groups, the pay gaps between men and women are smaller among Black and Hispanic workers compared with the within group gaps among white and Asian workers. And you can see it, it looks like they're doing better, okay? But this smaller pay gap among these groups is due solely to the fact that the men in these groups were paid substantially less than white and Asian men were paid, and that has been consistent over time. So race and ethnicity is a huge issue, and it's an important contributor, but age of workers is another important factor. You can see on this particular graph that among young people, ages 16 to 24, women are paid close to the same amount that men are paid. In the peak earning years, between 35 and 64, in contrast to that, women are paid 81% or less of what men are paid. But you can see on this graph, women are hurt the most in retirement. And I live in a retirement community, and I am a retired professional myself. So that kind of a statistic is really troubling to me. Okay, so education is a really interesting factor. Here's a spoiler alert. While education increases the amount women earn, it does not lessen the pay gap. So if we take a look at this particular slide, you can see that the pay gap exists at all levels of education. Let's do a little orientation here. Gold is, whoops, sorry. Got a little carried away there. Okay. The gold is women, the blue is men. The numbers in the boxes are the earnings ratio at each educational level, high school diploma through an advanced degree. You can see that women with less than a high school diploma were paid 77% of what their male peers were paid in 2018, whereas women with advanced degrees were paid only 74% of what men with advanced degrees were paid. So in some ways, advanced education doesn't help, it hurts. For college-educated women, this is a really important point. The gap exists 1 year out of school, and it widens by 10 years out. Although women in the US now earn more college and postgraduate degrees than men, women with bachelor's degrees working full-time are paid 26% less than their male counterparts. That 26% gap makes it harder for women to pay off their student debt. And in that regard, we know that 1 in 3 female college graduates have financial difficulties while repaying their student loans compared to 1 in 4 men. Women also hold 2/3 of the nation's $1.4 trillion in student debt. So education's a big deal. In addition to race, ethnicity, and education, age, disability also impacts the pay gap. According to the American Community Survey in 2018, people with disabilities made just 68% of what people without disabilities made. This is shown on the left side of this graphic. And among people with disabilities, the gender pay gap is substantial. The median pay for women with disabilities is 72% that of men with disabilities. And this is shown on the right side of this schematic. Now keep in mind, you can't compare these two sides directly because the all workers side includes men and women. But the graphic does give you a sense of the impact of disability on the wage gap. Occupation impacts the pay gap in 2 ways. 1, women tend to cluster in historically low-paying occupations, and 2, even when women are employed in higher-paying occupations, they earn a fraction of what men make. But let's take a look at this. The tendency for men and women to work in different fields with different levels of compensation is what researchers call occupational segregation. And that's what's shown in part on this particular graphic. This graph shows that the gender composition of the highest paying occupations, you can see men are overrepresented, and they again are in blue. In contrast, this graph shows the gender composition of the lowest paying occupations, and you can see that women are overrepresented in this particular area. Over the past 50 years, women have started to enter jobs that were once occupied almost entirely by men, but women and men still tend to work in different kinds of jobs. And this segregation by occupation is a major factor behind the pay gap, but it's not the whole story. Even when in jobs where the same level of skill is required, jobs associated with men tend to pay more. And even when women pursue those higher paying occupations, they are paid less across the board, even with advanced degrees. AAUW did a study and found that there were 10 occupations where women are losing out on the most money collectively. This particular chart shows the 5 of those 10 with the lowest earnings ratios, that is the highest pay gaps. They're also the highest paying jobs, even for women. However, if you add up this collective loss, in 2016, the collective loss was $75.2 billion. For women, for all working women, the collective loss was $500 billion in 2016. It's now $935 billion. dollars lost collectively due to the pay gap. And just to put that into a little bit of perspective, that amount would lift more than 2.5 million children out of poverty. So, race, ethnicity, age, education, disability, occupation. Another substantial contributor to the gender pay gap is different patterns of work. Now, this is not new. Women and men have always participated in the workforce in different ways and have been treated differently by employers. And though these differences have shrunk over time, they still contribute to women being paid less than men. Women tend to work fewer hours, even when they work full-time. They are more likely to take time away from the workforce to care for family, and are more likely to need flexible work hours and schedules. Many stay-at-home and part-time working mothers will eventually decide to return full-time to the workforce. And when they do, they may well encounter what is called the motherhood penalty, which actually extends beyond the actual time out of the workforce. Fathers, in contrast, do not suffer a penalty compared to other working men. Many fathers actually receive higher wages after having a child, and this is known as the fatherhood bonus. We know that the coronavirus has increased the impact on these factors on women. The millions of jobs lost have had an overwhelming impact on women. They are frontline workers in healthcare, childcare, and elder care. Many are in low-wage jobs that compete with other non-paid work like childcare, elder care, those kinds of things. And many can't work from home because their jobs require that they be in the workplace. And so many have left the workplace entirely. Last September, 800,000 women left the workforce. And by the end of December, another 156,000 dropped out. The impact on women is a huge economic setback and a threat to the economic security of families because, at least as of 2019, 64% of mothers were sole, primary, or co-breadwinners. And this will come up again, but this pandemic has laid bare not only the gender differences, but the racial differences, and the impact on women of color has been epic. Okay, so all the factors that we have discussed so far account for some of the differences in salaries, but they aren't the whole story. Research evidence points to the impact of bias and discrimination on women's pay relative to that of men. So we say that, and the immediate comeback is, so how do you know that discrimination and bias affect women's pay? Discrimination, we know, cannot be directly detected in most records of income and employment, so researchers look for what is called unexplained pay gap, statistically accounting for other factors, the ones we've just discussed. An AAUW report entitled Graduating to a Pay Gap examined this question. And according to and accounting for the issues we've talked about, the study found that there was a 7% difference in the earnings of women and men 1 year out after college graduation that was still unexplained. Studies by other researchers have found similar unemployment gaps or similar unexplained gaps, typically ranging from 7 to 11 or 12%. Schematically, we've presented this as an estimated 10% unexplained. And so what we are looking at is a discrimination factor around 10% that impacts women's salaries. So we know that multiple factors contribute to the pay gap. And those of us who are cockeyed optimists want to say, aren't we getting better? Let's see. While the pay gap has steadily narrowed over time, it is nowhere near being eliminated. And in recent years, not including the impact of the coronavirus, government data shows that progress has actually stalled. The gap has narrowed since 1960, due largely to women's progress in education and workforce participation, and to men's wages rising at a slower rate. You can see that on here, it's represented by the orange line. At the rate of change between 1960 and 2016, if things continued to change at that rate, we would be expected to reach pay equity with men in 2059. However, if the change continues at the slower rate that we've noted since 2001, women will not reach pay equity with men until 2119, and you can see that on this graphic on the blue line. These projections were pre-COVID, so the predictions of pay equity may actually be extended well beyond what's on this graph. So, we know that there are multiple contributing factors, and we've seen some improvement, but progress is essentially stalled. Okay. We know that understanding contributing factors is important, but we also need to consider federal public policy, pay equity laws in the US, and the pay gap in Florida. So we will address those topics next. Congress has a history of considering and in some cases enacting laws that address discrimination in employment. Yet these legal protections have not ensured equal pay for women and men, largely due to enforcement issues as well as loopholes in the law. Back in 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, which amended the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, but it is not well enforced. In 2009, President Obama signed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. This law lengthened the time period in which employees can bring legal actions for pay discrimination lawsuits. Other pending legislative actions, and you need to know that these have been languishing in Congress for some time, include the Paycheck Fairness Act, the Fair Pay Act, and the Fair Pay Equity Act for all of which would expand fair pay protections, strengthen enforcement efforts, and close loopholes. But again, they are still sitting in Congress. We've had some executive orders. In 2014, Obama signed 2 executive orders addressing pay discrimination, and he subsequently worked to add regulations to increase pay protections. In 2017, Trump rescinded several equal pay protections, including rolling back requirements for federal contractors to comply with labor and civil rights laws and halting implementation of a data collection tool that would increase wage transparency. In addition to complying with the 1963 Equal Pay Act and the 2009 Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, most states also have some kind of additional equal pay law. Until just recently, only 2 states, Alabama and Mississippi, had no state pay equity or sex-based employment discrimination regulations, and you can see them on the map in purple. Alabama now has a pay equity law. It was passed last year, so they're no longer purple. They actually have joined the orange crowd. All other states have at least some basic equal pay protections, but roughly 1/3 of the states have what have been described as weak equal pay laws, and those are in orange on the map. These weak laws provide basic protections, but they also have major loopholes that allow employers to continue to pay women less than their male peers. As I said, Alabama has joined those orange states, and you can see that Florida is among those states with weak equal pay laws. I'm located in Florida, you're based in Florida. So the question is, what's the status of pay equity in the state of Florida? This graph shows the downward trend in women's pay equity in Florida in the last 3 years. In 2017, the women to men's earnings ratio was 87.9% with a 12.1% pay gap. In 2018, that earnings ratio decreased to 82.6. And as of October of 2019, the women's median salary was 79.2% of men's. Over time in Florida, the women to men's earnings ratio has ranged from a low of 76.3%, that's a 23.7% gap. That was back in 2000. That was a low, and it raised to a high here in 2017. And is now on a downward trajectory. Now, you can look at this and say, Florida really has a relatively low pay gap, but the reasons behind that aren't necessarily positive. That is, wages in Florida have been declining for a decade, but men's median wages have decreased more than women's. So the smaller wage gap in our state isn't exactly beneficial if it's because everyone is making less money. So, in summary, the simple truth is that the pay gap is real and pervasive, and it affects all women. There is no one silver bullet to fix the problem. Rather, action needs to be taken on several fronts. Further, the impact of the coronavirus on the economy has hit women of color and single working mothers, but retired women the hardest. And finally, the pandemic has illuminated the systemic issues underlying the wage gap. So, what can we do? Well, for starters, federal budgets need to ensure adequate enforcement of all civil rights laws. Congress needs to pass the pending legislation that will shore up existing laws and close the loopholes. States need to enforce federal laws and write stronger state laws and then enforce them. The federal government also needs to reinstate the Obama order to collect pay data. And employers need to be more transparent in their pay policies, conducting regular pay audits, post salary ranges, eliminate the use of salary history in hiring, and prohibit retaliation against employees who seek redress from pay discrimination. So those are all things that need to be done outside of our sphere of direct influence. So the question then is what can we do? Folks, we can vote. And we can vote for those people who will support pay equity. We can advocate. We can lobby our representatives in Congress. And if you don't know where to start with advocacy, AAUW's Fight for Fair Pay advocacy page is a good way to start. Finally, we can educate. We can educate ourselves about the pay gap and teach women how to negotiate salaries. In that regard, AAUW has a free online workshop where individuals can learn to negotiate their own financial futures. It's called Work Smart. It's open to men and women. It's open to members and non-members. If you are interested or you have a colleague, a friend, a child, a spouse, you can see on the screen the web address for WorkSmart. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a pleasure to talk with you today about the gender pay gap. If you would like more information about AAUW or our Lake Sumter branch here in the Villages, here are our web addresses. Thank you so much, and I'll be happy to field whatever questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Linda. What a fascinating talk, and I think you really outlined a lot of the contours of this at the national and state level. Thank you very much. This is a topic of such great importance to everyone, men and women, and certainly to the next generation. As you point out, many children are raised by a single working mom, and her financial outlook is going to have a major impact on her kids' future as well.
Yeah, it's difficult, I think, for many of us to get out of our own circle of activity and recognize where women are working. They are in hourly wage jobs. They are frontline workers. They're in retail. They're in maintenance services and things of that nature. They can't work from home. And if they've got kids at home, the pandemic has decimated their lives. And again, the impact on people of color is profound. I'm not sure how to get the message clearly to the people who can make a decision about changing these laws. Some of the time it feels like we're pleading with people who do not have ears attached to the sides of their head.
Yes, I imagine so, but things like writing letters to the representatives, but I see where it feels like an uphill battle. I think and there's so many cultural forces too. It's interesting to think about the role of culture in some of this too. Obviously,
Oh, yes.
Here in the U.S. we have a different culture than say some other countries where pay equity is in some cases better, in some cases much worse, of course, with even lower levels of equality than we even have here. I think I am very interested in this, WorkSmart option that you mentioned. I think that's such an overlooked area, especially for women, negotiating skills, women in school, people early in their careers, even highly educated women often have, really no education about how to negotiate, or even think it's like a taboo thing, that it's somehow embarrassing or reflects poorly on them if they try to negotiate, that it, is somehow, a bad thing, which is of course ridiculous. But it's such a critical thing, to self-advocate. And again, there's some cultural aspects to that sometimes in the way that women are socialized differently from men. And
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, go ahead.
I think a lot of things are changing right now. And so it will be interesting to see how this plays out. I didn't notice a reversal of some of the pay gap policies when Biden was signing executive orders the other night, but I suspect he'll get to it. It's an issue that will change the lives of many people who are suffering and struggling in this country. And I think that's an important value.
Dr. Carpenter.
Yes, ma'am.
One thing that when I was doing my graduate studies, my doctoral studies at UCF, that I did was comparing the people that were from other countries and their studies. Is when you look at the different people, male and female, and what we studied here in the United States, what we chose, the traditional male and female studies in our country, and what people from other cultures studied. And we do the traditional, in ours, the traditional male and female studies, the hard sciences and the soft sciences in our culture, and the hard sciences and the soft sciences in their cultures. it reflects very differently. We choose the education and the soft sciences for females here and the hard sciences for the males. In the white Caucasian European-based people, and then we found that the Black African Americans were choosing here the law and the engineering, and it was very odd that and the people that were building their own businesses, that the Black and the African Americans, which are distinctly different. We have people from the islands that don't consider themselves African Americans, that were building their own businesses here. The Black women were making their own businesses here and were in the engineering and the law enforcement, but the white women weren't. And it's just, and we're very assertive and were demanding more than the white women were. And the white women were choosing education and the soft sciences, psychology and nursing, and weren't going into the medicine and the doctor and psychology, the higher level, higher paying education or medicine jobs. And it was just very telling when we teased out the results that the higher paying jobs were the white men and the Black women, and the white women were choosing all the lower paying jobs at the UCF courses. It was just very telling.
That's just really fascinating, and it leads to that occupational segregation that we're talking about. But the cultural factors that Karen was suggesting earlier clearly also come into play. Isn't there the myth of the white woman who is shy and retiring and ladylike and certainly not aggressive or assertive?
Mm-hmm.
That's just has not been valued in our society. And you may well be seeing a continuation of that. How did you account for your second finding, which was Black women? I'm not sure I can repeat what your actual finding was, but you said white men were in the top careers and Black women were right behind them. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah. If you look, when we're taught, I know that when I was growing up, that the girls were put in my schools, and I was in Girl Scouts, white Girl Scout troops and brownies and 4-H, and we were taught etiquette classes, and we were put into Montgomery Ward's etiquette classes and Sears classes on etiquette and modeling, and we were taught to be demure, and the boys were put out into Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts and taught aggression and everything. And then when I was teaching school, I was put through and taught and had the classes, pardon me, on understanding the fact that the boys were controlling the class, and I had to try and teach the girls how to ask questions and become assertive in the class, because the boys were more assertive and getting the attention in the class. So I knew the statistics there. If you look at the black statistics in some of the neighborhoods, the women are in charge of the household. They are the breadwinners. They are running the families, and they have no choice but to be the breadwinners. And they run a multi-generational home, and that's going to be the result of them ending up taking care of the family and going on and getting the education. And
what
that's
fields were you finding that they were gravitating toward?
law enforcement, and the harder sciences compared to, I would have to go back and dig those research papers out. That was 93 and 94 that we did this.
Yeah, I understand.
So that was, but it was more than the soft sciences. They were going for law enforcement, etc.
Mhm. I know over my own career too, I've worked with a lot of immigrant, professionals from different countries. And it's very interesting to see how different it can be. People's expectations are very much shaped by the environment and, frankly, by political policies that get put in place by the governments and whatever locale, So I think, Linda, your emphasis on, policy influence is very important and timely, and who knows, things may be changing here too. But I don't, for me, with this topic, there's always this kind of elephant in the room, which is really, the role of, childbearing and child care. And now increasingly with, many women, with professional women at least, delaying having children precisely because of some of these issues with, career advancement, that, they're doing, fertility treatments and, you need to take time off work for that. And then when kids come in, the style of parenting that's expected now is, a lot different than in the past, probably more intense, and I wonder sometimes, the role of all of this and just the role of childcare is so obviously related to the ability of women to, whether or not you can afford childcare, whether it's available, and, whether it's compatible with the kind of work schedule that you need to, have to perform, to kind of match the availability of men in these jobs. And I just wonder, what if you have any other thoughts on the role of childcare, whether subsidized or not, or just cultural elements related to that.
I think that dealing with some of the underlying inequities across gender, across race, across ethnicity will go a long way to lifting up the whole population. I think of my own experience, and I was not a single mother. I had a husband who was working. We had 2 incomes, although I had more advanced degrees than he did. He was earning more than I was. We knew that to be true. And because I was a professional woman, it was important that I have a place for my children where they would be safe and well cared for, so that I could think about the things I needed to be thinking about in my profession and not spend my days worried about the welfare of my children. Mm-hmm. The amount of time, effort, and resources that we threw into that was enormous. And we had a reasonable income. Mm-hmm. And lots of options. That's not true for many women today. My daughter is divorced. She is a single mom. Childcare has been an ongoing issue for her. And for the reasons that I mentioned, I don't care, and I don't think it matters what socioeconomic level you are living at in this country. People are concerned about their children. And if public policy recognizes that taking care of people in that way is good for the whole country, then we may see some changes. But I think that subsidized childcare is certainly a possibility. I can bring it right back to the state of Florida. In 2002, Florida voters mandated high quality voluntary pre-kindergarten. Okay. What they got was low quality because the legislature didn't want to spend money on it. And you may recall, in the midst of everything else going on in the last year or so, the readiness rates coming out of Florida is about 42%. So we're not willing as a society to take care of women and children, and we need to. I think it needs to be part of our national agenda. I also wanted to comment. I'm old enough to remember when in junior high, girls went to home economics, and boys went to shop. That's not shopping. That is
the wood
workshop,
shop.
wood shop,
Mhm.
machinery,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And much like Dr. O was saying, what did we learn? We learned how to cook. We learned how to sew. We learned how to do our nails and do personal grooming. We learned how to set a lovely table. We learned, how to be polite and those kinds of things. But they never once talked about how to stand up for yourself and be assertive. And I think that we are continuing to live with that. I'm hoping it's changing. Some of us raised our daughters a little differently. I always thought of mine as a woman child because she was.
I think there's been so much progress. At the same time, there's really a kind of renaissance of a lot of these values, almost like a backlash happening with these extremely, expectations of very time intensive, be it personal grooming or, child rearing, expectations that are just go way beyond what even previous generations would have thought was necessary, so just, incredible resources into the kind of domestic realm that really are taking women away from some of these other pursuits. Where it's really like on women, it's not like that men even are aware of some of these expectations, but there's kind of cultural pressures, I think, on people often. And I think the role of like a peer group too, and, wanting to be, accepted by others, maybe people in your community, people you grew up with, kind of sticking your neck out to earn a lot more money than anybody else, even if you deserve it, can put you in an awkward situation and be very isolating. So I think sometimes there are other social factors involved, that kind of keep people, in certain environments where, things will change.
Well, if you're running so hard just to stay in place,
Mhm.
you don't really make any progress. And again, I think of my daughter. There was a time when our grandson was very young. She was working 3 or 4 jobs just to make ends meet. And those ends needed to include feeding her kid, keeping a roof over their head. When in all of that was she going to have time to pursue a peer group or self-expression or self-improvement or anything other than I get up in the morning, I get my kid to school, I go to this job, I go to this job, I go to this job. Then I have to come home and take care of everything else. It just,
Very hard.
I think many of us would like to think we're superwoman, but I think that's counterproductive because it buys into the notion that, just bring it on. We can do it all. We can do all of it. And do it all with little or no pay. Sure. And I think that's a value in our society that needs to be examined.
You also add on to that, never getting stopped. And I think back to when I was going through graduate school and a professor, not professor, and an assistant professor who all the men in her university in Hawaii kept getting past people that she had mentored and kept getting past her to professor. And she had been their graduate professor through all their degrees, and they kept becoming associate, assistant, and then professor beyond her. And one day they found her sarong and her lei on the beach, and she had walked right out into the ocean after 20 years. And that struck me when I was going through graduate school, and my male professor who mentored me discussed it with me. And he also discussed the fact that I was lucky that of his female students, 2 out of 3 were divorced by the end of their doctoral degree. And he said, you're lucky that your husband stayed with you. But that it just struck me that she had gone all those years and had graduated all those doctoral students, and that they had gone and surpassed her and became a full professor from being students of hers, and that she would never become a full professor. And I don't know if it was due to her culture, but I saw them all around me at the university here also.
Yeah.
Very sad case. Well, I'm hopeful things are going to someday look different for our younger colleagues. I think the younger women now do have, the benefit of a lot more transparency about a lot of things. I think in our society, a lot of these things were swept under the rug or kind of taboo topics for a long time. And I think some of those taboos are really being lifted now. I think young people just have expectation that there's going to be, in some ways, more transparency, to learn about, how money is made and where. But I wonder, Linda, if you have any information or just thoughts on the, this dynamic of, kind of even knowing what other people are earning. I think in many workplaces, it's really a taboo, or there may even be, in the employment contracts, whatever prohibitions about discussing the salary that people are having. So I think a lot of women may not even be aware of how much their male colleagues are earning in some cases. So do you have any thoughts on that situation or advice?
Yeah, I was mentioning several actions that employers should be taking. And one is to eliminate that kind of contractual agreement that you'll never talk about it. And by the way, if you do, there will be retaliation. That needs to stop.
Right, but
there needs to be greater transparency.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
It's not illegal currently though, or is it in any, I'm not aware that that's necessarily an illegal practice, or, I mean, it shouldn't be, but are there laws prohibiting this or, requiring transparency?
That's kind of one of the loopholes. So the laws are very general, and there's a clause in the federal legislation that has an exception, and I see if here it is. Okay. In the law, there is a phrase called factor other than sex, so that you can justify a decision to pay someone less in equivalent jobs on factors other than sex.
Right.
So you have that enormous loophole right there.
Right.
Okay. And there's lots of ways to use that to get around the kinds of things that are being done. Obama's order of a evaluation tool, a way to measure and collect data on pay differences, that needs to be reinstated so that we have that kind of data. And I think that as more and more people push back on this, there may be a resulting change, but it's likely to be a slow process because there are a lot of people out there who will say there's no pay gap. It doesn't exist. And they're not willing to see the impact on women, the impact on the economy at large, the impact on children's growth and development. It's a ripple effect. And it's very difficult to just pull it out and say, oh, we're just going to look at this little piece here and not at everything else that it's connected to. It's why looking at the causal factors, Dr. O, you'll appreciate this, I'm sure. My dissertation director was famous for saying, people are looking for univariate solutions to multivariate problems. It's not a single cause, it's not a single solution. So all of those factors need to be adjusted and dealt with such that the playing field is leveled. And as much as we need to vote, advocate, and educate, and I think AAUW's Work Smart program is brilliant because it really will help everyone. We need to really push for policy changes and legislative changes. You hear the phrase, you can't legislate morality. I get that. I get that. But you can legislate practices that are fair and equitable and make sure that they are enforced and enforceable.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Linda. That is so true.
My pleasure.
Yeah, this has been a fascinating
Thank you.
talk. I'm so glad that we had a chance to host you today. Thank you again for joining us. And
thank you so much for asking. And, you know, if you ever want to just have a conversation with your group, talking is a good thing. Invite me back.
It certainly is. Oh, thank you so much. And we would love to post this talk online for club members to view, and maybe others from other clubs. I'll also post a link, if it's all right with you, to the Work Smart.
Please do.
I think that's a fantastic thing to have available, and I'm sure maybe the Rotaractors or others, advancing their careers can take advantage of that. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and I'm glad I got a chance to talk with the two of you. I'll look forward to connecting with you again in the future.